The imbalance has been so big and for so long that it's time that women, Black people, people of color, Indigenous communities get to take up a lot of space in the near future. It doesn't mean your voice is going to be ignored. It means that ours are going to be given preference for a little while in exchange for the length of time that the patriarchal voice has taken over, especially in classical music.
Hey everybody, this is Chris from honestypill.com. You are listening to episode 32 of the Honesty Pill podcast. This season on the show, I'll be talking to people who are breaking the status quo, ditching outdated traditions, and building a better future for themselves and the people they work with. I'll be connecting you with musicians, sound healers, coaches, hip-hop artists, actors, opera divas, and people who not only inspire and educate every single day, but who are experts at talking about what they do so you can get inspired in your own work. So it has been a minute since I published an episode of this podcast. There has been a lot going on with Honesty Pill coaching and LA Phil work and just readjusting to the entire world, getting back into the groove as the pandemic does whatever it's doing right now. So thank you for your patience, and I think you are really going to enjoy this episode. My guest today is performer, coach, and entrepreneur Elizabeth Gentner, and I just want to give you all a heads up. This was a heavy episode, and we hit a lot of topics, as you can tell from that intro clip, that I think are really critical and important to talk about. So I am going to be quiet and let Elizabeth do most of the talking on this episode. I do just want to set this up by asking you the question, what do you think about the word diva? Is it a good thing? Is it a negative thing? Have you ever referred to someone as a diva? And if so, what were you trying to communicate? We're going to get Elizabeth's definition and find out why she is taking that word back, and even went as far as to name her website, coaching, and brand after the word by becoming the reddiva.com. And by the way, I know there are a lot of people listening right now who are interested in taking auditions. There is so much audition strategy in this episode and pre-shot routines, doing the work and then learning to trust it under pressure, and how to become emotionally connected to the character and the moment that we are in during an audition. All right, that's enough out of me. Let's get into this conversation with the incredible Elizabeth Gentner. One of my favorite ways to introduce a guest on my podcast is to read their social media bio. So I'm going to do that right now. Here it is, straight off your Twitter account. Opera, smarty pants, rabble rouser, singer, coach, composer, podcaster, entrepreneur, and puppies. Welcome to the Honesty Pill podcast, Elizabeth Gentner.
Thank you. It's so nice to be here. I've always enjoyed your podcast, but yes.
So what's the deal with puppies? Do you have a lot of dogs at home, or are you just not a cat person?
Yes, I have two golden retrievers, and they're invariably creating ways to bring entertainment and laughter into my life. So it's just an important part of who I am, I think, it's just a reminder to be in the present moment. Dogs don't allow you, they literally come up to you and move your phone out of the way so that you can pet them. And that aggressive, no, I'm here, like it's time to play. It's very much what I'm about.
What a great way to kick off this podcast. Have you ever seen that? I think it's a New Yorker cartoon that has two depictions of a dog and his owner. Mm-hmm. And on the one side, it shows what a person thinks, and it shows the person's thought bubble. And there's like worry, money, cars, marriage, all this stuff. And then it says what a dog thinks. And it is exactly a replica of the scene that's happening right now.
Yeah.
It's like, I love that. I don't know if I did a good visual description of that, but it's like dogs are always in the present and they're total optimists too. Everything's going to be great.
Absolutely. They're just in love with happiness. And if you're gone, okay. But when you come back, it's like it's the most amazing moment in their whole life. And the reminder to reconnect is just really important. It's good for my mental health. It's good for my life.
That's awesome. I'm a dog person too. Nothing against cats.
No.
At all. Cats are phenomenal. They're like the way they move through the world and the way they own their space. I think it's incredible. I just prefer dogs. There I said it.
I'm allergic to cats. I have nothing against them. I think they're fascinating and fun and cute. And I found out that I was allergic by jumping into a pile of kittens. So
Well, as a person who makes their living singing, that's probably really good that you figured that out.
Yeah.
So your home on the web is the reddiva.com. I love this website name, Where did that come from? What do you want to communicate with that? And what exactly is the definition of a diva?
Oh, I love that question. This is amazing. I came up with that when I was looking for an email address when I was about 15, when AOL was a thing. I was trying to figure out like what I wanted it to be. I didn't necessarily want it to be my name because that wasn't what people were doing. And I had already determined that opera was a thing for me, 15, 16. And I have red hair, bright red hair. It's not subtle. And that was a name that I could grab right away. And it resonated with me and sort of my vibe. Diva specifically, I really love the word diva. And I think it's used in American culture as if it's a negative thing, but it means goddess in the Italian. It means female deity. And embodying that, at least when I'm on stage, maybe not all the time, it's an important part of who I am. It's an important part of what I believe humanity has to offer, that our intrinsic, internal, divine being, for lack of a better, it's a part of what it is to be a woman. And I enjoy that about my experience on this planet right now. And I think it's important to celebrate it rather than make it something that's, oh, well, she's being a diva. I'm like, what does that mean? Is she controlling the space and taking ownership of who she is and what she is in the world? Oh, no. How dare she?
Trumpet players get called divas all the time in the negative connotation. But I love the fact that we're kind of being silly about it, but I love that you've actually taken ownership over that word and turned it back around and used it as sort of like a North Star for how you live your life. I love that. I think we should all lean into our female inner goddesses, by the way. I think that's a great way to do it.
I do too. I think your inner diva is just shining all the time, Chris. I think you're doing a great job.
Well, thank you. All right. I think we can end the show right there. That's what I was searching for. I was looking for that compliment.
Okay, good. I'm glad I could give it to you.
So, Elizabeth, when did you get into singing? Were you always a kid who wanted to like put on a show, or was this something you discovered later in life?
I was my parents met singing in the San Antonio Symphony Opera Chorus.
Oh my God. So this was not even a choice for you.
Classical music was not an option. Singing specifically, I started singing at 3, like out in the world. At about the same time, I went to see a production of The Nutcracker, and I just decided that I should be able to go up there because there were kids on stage. My parents are trying to convince me to sit back down because I didn't have the right attire. The stage has always called, and I had the voice from a big, versatile voice from a very young age. And it was something that was easy for me. And I think people don't give enough credit to leaning towards what's easy for you. I think people are like, oh, it has to be hard. It has to be hard. And I do that myself sometimes as I try to make things more challenging. But singing inherently is easy for me. And the more successful I am at, the less effort I put forth.
I'm probably going to ask a lot of questions on this podcast that in areas I have absolutely no knowledge. So buckle up.
Sure.
And here comes another one. As a singer, your instrument is part of your body, and your body's changing. You're 15, you're 16, your voice is going through changes. Where do you draw the line, and how do you delineate the roadmap of learning vocal technique that's appropriate for your body and your voice type and what you should expect, all the while setting the foundation for maybe if somebody wants to become a professional singer? Like, how do you negotiate that?
Well, that's just it. It's a negotiation. Every day in the practice room, it's different every day. And the difference between when I was 15, 16, there were drastic changes going on. 20, 25, there were bigger changes going on. Now, as a fully grown human, it's just a fluctuation of my mood and how much water I've had and things like that. But when you're talking about building a technique with an instrument that is a variable in and of itself, you're looking for what's consistent and what's true. And what is true for my voice is that flexibility is the cornerstone on which I build everything. Runs fast, top to bottom. If that train is on and I can run through all of the extremes of my voice evenly, we're in for a great day. I build legato, line, breath support with the underlying idea of movement. So longer lines, sustaining things is a challenge for me. That is something that, it's consistent throughout my experience of being a singer. But I focus on what I do well and use that to do the thing that is more challenging for me. So in my brain, I'm doing little runs or tremolos underneath a long sustained note. If I'm, have a big long phrase, I imagine that I'm doing this big long cadenza with lots of movement in it because I know that works. And it has always worked without a lot of effort. And even as you're adjusting things for vowels and whatever, you're looking for the consistency through the movement for me. If I can maintain that, the other things are built on that.
It's interesting. Did your parents, you're talking about like, it's okay to lean into things you're good at. Did they notice, or did somebody pick you out and say, that kid has a natural voice? Do you hear that? Or where did that awareness come from?
My parents definitely supported any musical endeavors. I got a lot of external validation because I picked up music quickly. So I picked up the oral information and was able to spit out. My mom told me that I was matching pitch at like 7 or 8 months or something. Not normal, but I guess it was normal for my upbringing.
That's a fun party trick, right? Like, hey, guys, check out what Elizabeth can do.
You get feedback as a kid that you're doing well for that. And okay, well, I'll keep doing that. I also played oboe in like middle school and high school, but singing was definitely easier than that.
I think everything is easier than playing the oboe, but that's a different podcast. So growing up, who inspired you the most? Leontyne
Price. I was fascinated by her every time I've heard her. She's still one of my favorites. Her recording of the Verdi Requiem is something that it's on my most played list every year. She's phenomenal. And it was always phenomenal to me that somebody was that successful with every disadvantage that the world could throw at her. And I just find her career fascinating, and her endurance for all of these things, and her voice is just stunning.
Good choice. And that I'm familiar with that recording. I love the Verdi Requiem, and specifically that recording too. We're going to talk about this a little bit later, but talking about the disadvantages that the world threw at her, what were some of those? Can you highlight those for us?
Oh, a Black woman in classical music, everything that you can throw at her, you threw at her. And the systemic disenfranchisement, but outright racial insults to her face, and not being allowed to sing in certain spaces, despite having the credentials and the resume that proved that she was more than successful at every level. Having to go to Europe instead of being performing in the United States, especially in some of the southern places. She didn't come from, a classical music family the way that I did, like not in that way. And the discrepancy there is just, I found myself very deeply moved by her journey at every stage, it seemed. And when you hear her speak, she talks about the endurance and how much she loves singing. And that, it's just so important to keep you centered on what you do, what advantages you do have, even if you do have disadvantages. Everybody does, especially pursuing classical music.
That's a great takeaway. And I think about, there's so many musicians, especially Black jazz musicians, who were the headliners, and yet they weren't allowed to come in through the front door.
Exactly.
I mean, we always joke about musicians have to enter through the kitchen, but it was a real problem, and it's amazing that they even showed up.
Right.
That just shows to the testament of their will to own their own artistry and engage in it, regardless of the fact that the people who were hiring them wanted them to come in unseen, unheard, through the kitchen. Mm-hmm. We're going to dig into this topic a lot in this conversation, I think. I want to talk a little bit more about you as a performer.
Sure.
You are a professional performer who travels the world performing opera. You've made impressions on audiences across the globe. You love being on stage, connecting with audiences through music. How has that been going for the last 2 years?
Not so much. Obviously, with the pandemic, everything came to a screeching halt. And I put up a concert of my own this past May, which I really love doing. I performed with Kathleen Kelly, who's a phenomenal artist. And we did a concert full of things that I just loved to sing. Singing after being away from the stage for a very long time was a very emotional experience for me. And I miss some of the things that existed before the pandemic. And I was looking at the landscape for auditions and stuff, something like that. And something shifted for me with the pandemic. And I found myself not wanting to seek out other people's validation to sing. And the audition process is very much about that. You're going to get other people's approval for what you're offering. And I found myself far more interested in creating my own opportunities and creating my own path as an artist. So since the pandemic, it's not silver lining exactly, but an opportunity to reassess what I was doing. And I love performing on stages. I love getting the opportunity to stand up and sing a Violetta and Alice Ford. Oh my gosh, so much fun. It's electric when you get the chance to do that. But I had been missing my own creativity and my own sense of what I found inspiring. And while I love singing a great Verdi opera, like give it to me, please, I needed a little break to sort of reassess who I was, what I was offering. And the pandemic has offered that in a way that's really been healthy for me to refocus on. I write a lot more now, and I'm writing a performance piece for later this October. I'm writing for myself and I'm writing poetry, and that experience in shifting my focus as an artist has been really good for me and my voice.
You're inspiring so many questions and thoughts right now. I'm thinking about the Verdi Requiem. So it's a huge piece of music. Mm-hmm. There's so many moving parts, right? And there's an audience that has, gotten out of their house, into their cars, put their concert clothes on, maybe had dinner, and everybody showed up at 8:00 p.m. Mm-hmm. And at 8:01, we're all in this moment together. And I sometimes sit on stage as we're tuning in the orchestra and think, it's insane the amount of individual schedules and moving parts that occurred in the past 24 hours that have brought all of us here in this space together to literally vibrate in this moment during this piece of music that was written by somebody who's not even here anymore. It's remarkable. So let's talk about, how do you end up on the stage? What is a vocal audition to get a role like? Because I know I've learned this recently through this podcast. Being a singer is very different, the audition process, than being an orchestral musician. What does it look like for you to get through that process?
The audition process itself, it's very competitive, especially for sopranos. There are a lot of very talented sopranos in the world singing opera. We each have our unique flair, as it were, but to succeed in an audition, you have to show up with your music note perfect, know what you're saying, know what you're singing, be able to work with somebody who you've never worked before off the top. I mean, you can bring your own pianist, but often you're dealing with somebody at the piano who you've never met before. That kind of flexibility as a musician is something really important. And you show up and you have to give a show, and you walk it, like from the minute you walk in, you are giving that show. It's not just about professionalism. It's also about engagement. If you can get them to look up from their notes, that's really important. If they connect with you, and that in the moment connection is my favorite part, but it is more challenging to sort of drop in and get there. If you're singing, an aria from an opera, you've usually had at least 15 minutes of stage activity before you dive into the hardest part of the opera. And then after you give that first show, they usually ask for another aria, which is completely different. Usually there will be similarities, but it's in a different language most of the time, showing off different skills. So you have to give another show right then. And that ability to drop into the connection point is key. The music, all the words, knowing what you're singing, all of that is presupposed that you have already done all of that work. In the moment, you have to be connected to the people who you're performing for, whoever they are. And that energy, if you can get all the way into that, you can really be successful.
Have you ever been in a Tesla?
A Tesla, like the car?
The car.
No, I have not yet. I've
So,
seen them.
so
I
the reason
haven't
I
been in.
ask is a friend of mine had bought a Tesla, and
Mhm.
he said, "You come for a ride in this car." So I hopped on the passenger seat, and we were just driving along at 15 miles per hour, and all of a sudden he punched the accelerator, and the car just launched like 100 miles an hour. It was very upsetting, actually, but the feeling of like suddenly moving that fast is kind of how I think of auditions sometimes, in that you have to go 100 miles an hour in this direction and then turn on a dime and go 100 miles an hour in the other direction with no prep. There's no context. Auditions are so weird that way, in that your whole job, like you just said, is to create that connection and context when there is none around you.
Mhm.
So it's got to be probably the most challenging part of auditions, I think.
It is. The work that you do ahead of time is to allow you to let go of all that work when you're in the moment. And that's the tricky part. It's not singing the thing. Singing the thing is going to happen. It's just letting go of your inner critic who's going, "Oh, well, that was a little fast. Oh, did we breathe there? Oh, crap." The monitor telling you that you're not doing it quite right. That voice is like enemy number one for auditions.
You mentioned something about knowing the words you were singing, because obviously opera is in many different languages, some of which a musician may or may not be fluent in. And it reminds me of, and listeners, I challenge you to think about this yourself. What tune from your childhood, me growing up in the 80s, did you know every single word to that song? But if I asked you to tell me what the heck it was about, you would have no earthly clue. I think musicians do that in work as well, where they're playing an excerpt or they're singing an aria, and they've sort of pat themselves on the back by just having learned the notes and haven't actually gotten over that hurdle of what's the context? What's actually going on here? What are you trying to communicate? What's the character? And I think that is a thing that is key to actually getting over the hump of what differentiates you from being a finalist and getting hired.
I 100% agree. And one of the things that I do to combat that is my warm-ups tend to look like what comes right before the aria.
How so?
Rather than going over like the hard run or whatever, which maybe you touch point on that. But the warm-up for an audition for me looks more like the 15 minutes before I would sing that aria in the opera. So like if I'm going to sing Sempre Libera, I'm going to sing the first 15 minutes of La Traviata to myself. And go through that mental process and seeing those things. Verdi's a genius. That chunk of the opera is a perfect setup for that aria. And I'm the kind of soprano where that's the hardest part of the whole opera for me, because you got to have that high sustained stuff for a long time. But that 15 minutes before it, through the Libiamo, all of that festive, you're in a party. You can get to that party in your own mind before you show up for that audition, you can rock the hell out of that.
All right, people, auditioners, get your pens and paper out. Elizabeth is dropping you audition strategy gold here, and I want to highlight this technique that she's talking about. I call it the pre-shot routine. This is from Bob Rotella, Golf is Not a Game of Perfect. If you don't know what the setup is in what you're about to play, if you don't know what the cellos are doing before you come in on the Gershwin American in Paris, you have no context and you have no runway and you have no pre-shot routine. And if you do play that music well and communicate the context, it's luck. You can be way more intentional by just knowing and like retreading that runway over and over and over again so it feels second nature. I love that you just said that. And you're talking about 15 minutes of pre-shot routine.
Yeah, usually. The sustaining for I don't need 15 minutes to warm up to sing at the level that I do. But for that, it's more about the mental game than it is about the vocal warm up per se.
Talk about that. Tell me about the mental game. What would you say is like something we should consider when we're learning to tap into the power of that mental game?
You have to trust your work. You have to trust that you have done the work on whatever you're doing by the time you show up in an audition or a performance. You have to trust that you know what's going to happen. Mistakes happen, but you have to trust that work. When I'm singing at the apex of my ability, it is because I am deeply emotionally connected to the character and the moment that I'm in. I can't be thinking about the high note at the end. I can't be thinking about what I just did. I have to be in the emotional moment for the character that I'm performing. And so I'm using Violetta as an example. She is hosting this big party. She is in charge of the in charge of the entertainment for the evening. She has to be going hard about enjoyment. And there's this distraction, this man. This man. And I, the performer, can't focus on that. I'm trying not to focus on that. So I have to be about the party and about the physical things that happen. She's got consumption. So there's a deficit of breath that actually really makes that last run light up. So if you're desperately trying to grab air and you think about you already having a deficit for that, you're extra aware of filling your lungs because they hurt and they need more air than you would normally need. And that powers through those lightning fast runs. And that's how you communicate that she is just the light of the party. And she's somebody who loves and loves deeply, because you can get all the way to that moment when you're like, I'm so energized. I just need more breath. If I can get more breath, I'm going to fly and it's going to be amazing. And I'm going to be free. And that motivation is just so inherent to her as a character. When you embody that as a performer, it's easy.
All right. So you just heard it. If you want to give a compelling performance, be the party. Excellent. Excellent. You just created a hashtag there, I think. Do you have a role that you love more than any other and just can't wait to perform?
Alice Ford.
Why?
She is also the life of the party, but she is a mastermind. She is brilliant and she has a deep sense of justice and huge compassion for people. And that balance describes me better than any other opera character in the traditional literature, for sure.
Have you performed that role?
I have. It was the most fun I've ever had on stage. The cast was amazing. We had a great music director, Elizabeth Gentner. We had so much fun. She's upstage, stage directing the opera from the stage, basically, like manipulating her husband a little bit so that he gets taught a lesson. You know, she and her best friend set out to teach this man who was being completely outrageously sexist and insulting a lesson. And they do. And in the meantime, she just has so much fun. It's just fun. Just fun.
Spoiler alert, he learns his lesson. Okay.
He does.
Okay, good to know. This is why opera rap parties are so much fun, because you guys bond and you become the party, just like you said. If you had to put a percentage on it, how much of opera is singing and how much of it is acting?
Oh, I have opinions. The singing must exist. Like the good singing, the consistent, the use of your instrument must be a foregone conclusion. But you do not have an opera if you are not conveying meaning and story. I've sung concerts and I love singing concerts, and there are works of art where I am singing and nothing more. Those are great performance pieces and they have something to say. But an opera is a 2.5 hour, give or take, maybe more, maybe maybe much more, depending on who we're talking about, storytelling experience. If you are not connected to the story and to the characters, I don't see the point. These arias by themselves as performance pieces are gorgeous and works of art, but the opera as a whole must tell a story or the audience is sitting there twiddling their thumbs. I think that that's something important that we need to look at. The pre-existing literature for a lot of the pre-existing literature gives a lot of time to dialogue, but like with recitative, that doesn't need to be there if we're telling the story with intention. So we can tell these stories with deep emotional acting experiences, but my voice does a lot of acting. So it's not always about like the stagecraft or where your hand is. And there are some things that our friends in the music theater and acting venues do that we do differently because we are supporting all of this amazing sound, but acting has to be there. It has to.
I think what you just said is so important about meaning and story. This conversation is really about communicating something through music and shouldn't all trumpet players be doing that? Shouldn't all musicians be doing that? Shouldn't all of us be doing that? That's why we created art, right? To connect and communicate.
Absolutely. There's nothing else. I mean, so I call it the infinite space of connection.
Oh, I love it.
The vibe that you get when you project something out into the world, specifically to an audience, and they receive it and they're enjoying it, and they send this vibe of appreciation back at you, and you get to take that in, and it amplifies what you're doing, and you get to send it back out, and it creates this infinite loop of feedback where you're sharing and you're feeling better because you're sharing, and because you're sharing, they're loving it. And because they're loving it, you're sharing better. And that's the whole reason I am a human, is to share the experience that I'm having on this earth.
And we'll be right back. I want to give a huge thanks to the sponsor of the Honesty Pill podcast, Yamaha Corporation of America. I've been playing Yamaha equipment for decades in my own practice room, on stage with the Los Angeles Philharmonic, or touring all over the world, and Yamaha has been an absolute game changer. Something I love about Yamaha is the way they pursue excellence in all of their work and at all levels. They are as dedicated to bringing quality work for beginning students as they are for marquee artists. I admire their commitment to continuous improvement and creating a community that includes all of the musicians they serve. Make every note count, play Yamaha. Okay, let's get back to the show. Sometimes people ask me, do you get bored playing the same pieces of music more than one time? Like, you know, we'll do Tchaik 4 or Mahler 1 or whatever. Mm-hmm. And I always say the same thing. Number one, I'm always a different person when I show up for these pieces. I'm in a different place. I have different thoughts, how I show up for the performance. Yes, the notation and the notes are the same. The conductor is going to be bringing me their interpretation. I am showing up as a different person. But more importantly, the audience brings that energy. Like you just said, they're in receiving mode, and therefore they radiate that back, and it becomes this loop that everybody can feel. And that's why when there's an amazing performance, this moment that hasn't been recorded, it's not being live streamed, it's just, it only exists from 8 to 10 p.m., or in opera's case, 8 to 1 a.m. Like, that is a magical space to be in. You know, I think that's sort of the whole point, and I think it gets missed sometimes when we forget to just open the door to that connection.
I think that's 100% right, because I think sometimes we get caught up in our own estimation or experience of our own performing and forget that the purpose is to connect. The audience wants to not just see some show happen, they want to connect to it deeply. And my experiences as an audience member are deeper and more fulfilling when the artists are sharing rather than going through the motions. And that distinction is important. And the gift that is performing, it's just one of the greatest things in the world, especially as an audience member.
Totally. 100%. Sometimes on this podcast, by the way, I ask questions as a mouthpiece for maybe someone who doesn't know about opera or orchestral music or whatever. They're just listening to this. And so I'm going to ask one of those questions right now.
Okay.
First of all, what is the longest opera? And why are operas so long?
I think the longest opera is one of the Wagner. It's got to be one of the Ring. I don't remember which, to be perfectly honest. It depends on the conductor, because they can take it really fast or really slow. But
ballpark, how many hours are you sitting if you're going to go?
5.
So 5 hours of opera. Just in case you don't know, listener, you can show up for an opera at 8 o'clock. I don't know. Does a 5-hour opera start that late?
They usually start them a little earlier, like 7 or something.
7. Okay. So that doesn't make it much better. But no. Why are these stories, why does it take 5 hours for Wagner to communicate? Or does he want us to sort of check into his world for that long?
Wagner was really in for his interpretation of everything. He got very excited about his own agenda for the performance. He's not my favorite human. Agreed. He's somebody who was involved with a lot of racist and evil things. And there's a lot of egocentrism with him he built that whole theater for him. The like the Cinderella Castle, spent lots and lots of money from a country that didn't have it on building this castle dedicated to his operas. I have a lot of there are a lot of stories that I don't want to go into because they're not great things to have done as a human. Opera in general has this longer time period because it used to be the sole entertainment for that evening. So a 4-hour opera, and lots of those in Paris, would include a half an hour ballet. So when people went to the opera before now, they would go for the evening. And it was a whole event where everybody was doing all kinds of things. They were drinking, they were eating, they were yelling at their favorite characters, like yelling at their favorite villains and screaming, da capo, do it again. So that experience wasn't just the story. It was also a societal event where everybody from kings and queens down to the peasantry would attend. It gives it a different flavor than what we're prepared for now in the 21st century. The length is something that I think does need to be narrowed a bit for modern. We're not just going to the opera. It's not the only thing that we're doing. I think we have the space to have a shorter. I don't mean never go to 3 hours. I mean, just maybe not the 5. We are telling a whole story. So it's more like going to the theater for a couple of hours for a play, a long play that is telling a whole story about several people and characters. Plus, inside of the opera, when we're talking about arias and ensembles, we are diving so deep into the moment. So you get 10 minutes for that moment where the soprano and the tenor realize that they're in love with each other. We get to talk all about it, music all about it. We get to give that moment in time 10 minutes with aural and emotional space. And that's one of the things that opera does that no other art form does for me. It gives space to these deep emotions that are integral to the human experience. When we talk about love, there's so many variations on what people's experiences are. Getting some of that nuance rather than like in a play, you get that moment where you're looking at your partner, the other person on stage, and you get a couple seconds there, but you don't get 10 minutes to talk about how you feel. And that's something that I think modern society really could use.
Hear, hear. Have you ever had to perform across someone who you're supposed to be in love with, but you actually couldn't stand them in real life?
Yeah.
Well, you answered that really quickly, Elizabeth. No, I mean, think that's really challenging to have to sort of suspend reality and go in and just be in that presence with that other person.
It is. It's not part of it. I think as an actor, that part of what I do, it's not all me. There are aspects of me there. So to bring truth to it, some of you has to be there, but it doesn't mean that I am in love with Othello. That's not necessarily what the vibe is. And the music lends itself to creating your own 360-degree reality in that moment. So yes, I've had to kiss people who I'm not fans of, but like, if you can make it real for yourself, maybe I'm not visioning the person who's driven me nuts, but the experience of doing that and coming up with ways to cultivate what I would do if this were the love of my life and going through that mentally, and the music and opera's kind of weird. You get some space from that also. I mean, like, even if it were the love of my life standing right in front of me, there are some logistical issues. I'm making a lot of sound. They are making a lot of sound. I'm not just responding as a young woman in love because I've got technical things going on that have to happen. And there's a lot of sound coming at me that we're trying to strategically give to the audience. So, I mean, like movie actors do this too. They might be in a very close, intimate position with somebody who they're not close with, but there's intimacy directors. And I think opera is starting to use professionals from these other spheres in a healthy way that makes sure that everybody's safe and cared for. And I think that's an important step forward.
Speaking of creating our realities, I want to shift gears a little bit into social media because it's hard to be an entrepreneur or even a performing musician without having some sort of social media presence, and you are no exception. Elizabeth, you are so active on Twitter, and I was thinking about my own super neglected Twitter account, which I think I have about 30 followers. I think you're one of them, and I think maybe I've posted or tweeted is what you call it, right? Maybe 10 times. For some reason, Twitter is a platform that I've completely neglected for my own business. Why is that platform so attractive to you? How is it different from Facebook and Instagram as a musician?
Twitter has the ability to target your audience and talk to everybody at the same time in a way that the others don't. So I can have like one hashtag and I can limit it to opera Twitter. And by the people who follow me, most of who I hit are musicians, composers, or performers. That targeting, like engaging with people who are saying something out loud and acknowledging that sometimes what you say out loud is not your deeper thought. So it's a great place for that controversial statement. It's a great place to target what's not working in an industry in a way that elevates. And some of those big statements like opera needs to be focused far more on people of color and female voices in its future endeavors. We need to be doing more works. I could make a statement like that and it garners a lot of attention quickly. And then in the comments, we have the detailed discussion. And so that short, simple statement that might be controversial, that's the platform where that takes off the fastest. And I am good, very good at seeing that touch point.
Speaking of targeting what's not working, I'm going to share a definition and then ask you a question. So here we go. Definition: patriarchy, a system of society or government in which men hold the power and women are largely excluded from it. I'm a white dude. For a minute, imagine that I am the embodiment of all the things that are wrong with classical music. Really look at me and see me as a representation of everything that is bad about our field in this moment. By the way, hopefully, I'm not personally perpetuating so many of those problems, but that's a longer conversation for another day. What do you want to say to me, the embodiment of the patriarchy in classical music?
It's an excellent question. It's time to give us space. It's time to give us more space than you're ready to give up. The imbalance has been so big and for so long that it's time that women, Black people, people of color, Indigenous communities get to take up a lot of space in the near future. If you're looking for a balanced equity that can come after we are allowed to take up all of the space for a little while. It doesn't mean your voice is going to be ignored long term. It means that ours are going to be given preference for a little while in exchange for the length of time that the patriarchal voice has taken over, especially in classical music.
Thank you for sharing that. And that's been a long time.
Very long time.
Yeah.
Classical music specifically, I think that's part of my evolution, especially over this pandemic, is seeing some of the ways that the way that classical music operates is very much a part of that patriarchal system. The dependence on criticism as a primary method of education, it's not healthy. The psychology doesn't back that up as an effective learning vehicle. It comes down to my idea is better than yours kind of idea. And I am a white woman. I have plenty of privilege myself. But rather than approaching different venues of music as equal but different and fascinating and equally valid, we do this. This is the only way to do it because this is the way we have done it. And that is something that needs to systemically shift. There is so much value in music from other cultures and music that isn't necessarily classical that is informing our classical music all the time. We just need to honor that and honor the fact that that's coming from spaces that are not white and validate their experience, that this is their culture, this is their music, these are their creations. And I have things that I create, and I think that we could create so many fascinating things together rather than saying that this is the way we've always done it and this is what we're going to support. It's a closed-minded, limited idea, and the possibilities for music are infinite, and that's what I want to embrace.
Can I share a quote from an article I found that I just want to share here, which is about our history? And it's matriarchal societies may have been actually more common in our ancestral communities. Strong female relationships would have helped glue a larger community together, and be able to rely on friends to babysit would have given ancestors time and energy to support the group through food provision and other activities. Actually, there are several societies where matriarchy is the norm, including cacao farmers in Costa Rica and rice farmers in Sumatra, Indonesia. These are communities in which women are the landowners and the decision makers. All that is to say is humans are not genetically programmed for male dominance.
That's 100% right. We talk about a lot of cultures before, European imperialism and what have you. You talked about Costa Rica, Peru. They all have cultures that deeply honor the differences rather than putting one above the other necessarily. I think a lot of Native American cultures, what I have read, try to read as much as I can. I'm not an expert, but a lot of the honor that they treat women with, and they were the storytellers, they were the keepers of history, that kind of collaboration in what's possible. We're going to come back to the diva idea, the idea that the inner goddess that I believe every woman has, that part of us is, for lack of a better word, holy, although I don't mean it in a religious concept. There's power in who we are as individuals. If you're LGBTQ plus or transgender or what have you, there is a unique, beautiful experience there. And by putting one type of experience above another, we don't honor that we're all just energy experiencing this beautiful thing called Earth. It's not about who wins. It's about the infinite possibilities that we can create together. And it's so beautiful a concept that I have frustration for people who can't see how amazing it could be if we could just all get along and create beautiful things together.
I am with you in that frustration, and many, many, many other people are, and that's what keeps me going every day. I want to do another crowbar modulation here in our conversation. I have a client who is actually a guest on this podcast, giving a quick shout out to Scott at takecreativemeasures.com, who focuses a lot of his teaching on helping people with different learning styles become successful and helping teachers understand how to work with people who don't learn necessarily the way that they do. I mentioned this because your Twitter thread has a lot of references to neurodivergent thinking, ADHD, and how it impacts so many musicians in our industry, and just as human beings in general. Could I ask you to speak to that a little bit? How has that impacted your own journey? What are some of the challenges that you've overcome?
So I identify as neurodivergent. I was diagnosed with ADHD, or I was diagnosed with ADD as a child when I was 6. I was told specifically that women didn't have ADHD.
What?
That's a whole thing. I also am somewhat dyslexic. So I had a lot of struggle in school because I was very smart. So I'd be doing really great in some things, but couldn't spell or would mix up words oddly. And, everybody kept saying, you're not living up to your potential. You're so smart. Why can't you figure this out? Right. That was a frustrating experience in general. And the experience of being neurodivergent in a world that expects you to sit still in a room for 8 hours is a little cringe to me, because I don't think that that's normal behavior for any human, especially not children. Music was a huge outlet and a place where I felt far more comfortable. Oddly, with my dyslexia, if you put a musical score around words, the letters don't move as much. So it was a structure that helped me literally read better. Learning German I think I was third grade. I started learning German. It was the first time I realized letters were supposed to stay still because I couldn't pronounce any German if I wasn't reading letter by letter. So those kinds of things. And as you get older, I look at the world differently than a lot of people do. And I don't think that that's a deficiency or a disability. I feel that the way that I look at things, which is I tend to look at the big picture and see how everything integrates into it rather than learning little pieces and seeing how they stack together and then starting to get an idea of the big picture. It's not better, it's just different. And it allows me to see trends in the world, trends in business, trends in music in a way that my peers do not. It's just a difference. Honestly, it's not something that like is transformative or whatever, but the way we create educational spaces does not allow for that difference. And that's the flaw. It's the open-mindedness that's possible. Music is a perfect tool to teach neurodivergent children about all kinds of things, but it's like also a great tool to teach neurotypicals about these kinds of things. But the integration of ideas, if you want to teach math to a kid with neurodivergence, teaching them a linear fashion, like the order of it, it's not going to go the same. The integration process, I learned more about math from music than I ever learned in a math classroom. That the cross-referencing of topics and connecting things to one another, that informs how I speak. That informs how I move through the world. And I learned a ton in history, but I didn't do great in history class. But when I got to like advanced musical studies, I had all this history knowledge that connected back into things. And that interconnectedness is something that I think is really valuable in connecting neurotypicals and neurodivergence. I think that we can connect them in a way where they're teaching each other, sort of like in Montessori philosophy, but I think we should continue that concept all through into upper level college, where we're teaching each other what we have learned, and the practice of teaching what we have learned informs someone else, and it teaches us at the same time.
Can I ask a very rookie question about dyslexia? Because you mentioned that when you look at words on a score, they're not moving around. I always assumed that sharps and flats and harmonics and notes that are next to each other would constantly be flipping around. Is that not true?
Some people might have that experience. Dyslexia can be very different and there are degrees to it. The score itself, the 5 lines, it anchors it in a way that keeps my brain from moving things around. It's like you put it on a grid to keep it still and keep it in perspective.
Has anyone done any work around this in terms of being used as a tool?
They have, if you go to, I can give you some resources after this. I can't come up with the names off the top of my head, but they have shown that musical education does improve outcomes for kids with dyslexia. Nobody knew that when I was growing up, but it was something that I used. And also the German thing, because unlike English, every letter or 2 letters has a sound in German. It's very phonetic. There's not a lot of silent letters or consonants that change their sound. That structure was very helpful for me. And so then when I took that information back to English, I started spelling things correctly and seeing how things worked after the fact.
Unbelievable amounts of challenges, and yet you have become unbelievably successful. So let's talk about success for a moment. You're not only a performer, but you're also a coach and an entrepreneur. Wearing all those different hats, how do you define success considering the fact that our industry is changing so much? In other words, how would you define success as a musician in 2022?
I'm having fun doing the projects that I'm excited about right now. And that is definitely success for me. I don't think that putting a specific venue or role on my list of things that I have to perform to consider myself successful is really, that doesn't ring true anymore. Although I thought that's what it meant when I was a kid. But now having freedom to pursue what I'm passionate about is my definition of success. And right now, that as an entrepreneur, I am running a travel business, which I'm excited about and having fun because I love travel a lot. And I have run financial firms. I have run bookkeeping services. I have run professional coaching things now, and I'm enjoying all of it. And that's my definition of success because I'm having fun and connecting with people about things that I love.
Again, radical idea. Having fun equals success. Radical.
Yes.
Who'd have thunk it? So today you are a podcaster on a podcast. Can we talk about your own project, Opera Uprising, a podcast for operatic change? And I want to share some background and context from your website. This is right off Elizabeth's website at thereddiva.com about Opera Uprising. There is an amazing depth of talent and creativity in young opera singers who are left out of young artist programs every year. At every step forward in the traditional path, women, people of color, and LGBTQ plus individuals are left out without funding, without roles, without education. Instead of nurturing these young artists, the system abandons them. I know we touched on this a little bit. Can you explain the systemic breakdown? What needs to change? How do we make these things happen? What do you want people to know?
So Middle Class Artist did an article that I'll send you where they went in and did some research on the funding of opera across the levels. So the people who apply to an undergrad degree in vocal performance are 80% female, 20% male, give or take. I don't have the numbers in front of me. And the funding for that same level is exactly the opposite. 80% of the funding goes to men, 20% goes to women. That trend modifies a little bit as you go up the scale, but it holds true from undergrad into grad school, into these young artist programs, into the highest level of young artist programs, and into the professional sphere. Every opera from the old canon has the same, it's like 80% men, and there are 2 or 3 women per opera. But the population of people who want to be opera singers is the opposite, 80% female, 20% male. There's just a gap in what's possible there. And there's a number of things that we can do to change it. But there's so many young women who are amazing and talented and have done all this research and have worked on languages. And if they don't get this gig where they're so few jobs available at each level as they go up, they're not included anymore. There's no funding for them to continue. So many of them work hard at other jobs to continue their studies because they're so passionate about this art form. And that passion it's not being given a place to thrive. And that passion is so valuable and so important. And it boggles my mind that group of humans is not being supported in their love of music and artistry. When a simple solution would be to have people write all female operas, maybe 1 or 2 that aren't about nuns.
I literally was thinking while you were speaking, it needs to be written by a woman, performed with an all-woman cast for women. But here's the problem. And this is the thing I don't know how to fix, and it's not for me to fix, but this needs to be fixed. If that were to be, let's say the Met put that out. Sure. They're going to do an all-female opera written by a woman. The whole orchestra is going to be women. There would be so many people, men mostly, who would say, that's not fair, that's not balanced, that makes no sense. The problem is there's an illiteracy in the numbers that have been going on for hundreds of years that have led to the need for this overcorrection.
Yeah.
And I don't know how to get that story across, because I think if you don't know it, especially if you're super comfortable and you're benefiting from the privilege, you don't want to know it, right? So, sure. I mean, I'm glad you said an all-women opera. I would love to see that.
Some of the examples that I give are recent operas that were done that were new. Girls of the Golden West, done by San Francisco Opera. It only had two female leads, and both of them were prostitutes, but it's called Girls of the Golden West. Moby Dick, all male cast. I think this was like 4 or 5 years ago, and one female boy, like played by a soprano. This happens over and over and over again. The new opera is still 70 to 80% male characters. There's a huge opportunity to change voice casting. So Chicago Opera Theater just did a Carmen where they changed the gender of Don Jose. Stephanie Blythe got to do that. Let's keep doing that. I'll sing Cavaradossi in a second. I mean, like, that would be fun. And it opens up some opportunities. It's not, nobody is saying that we have to abandon the old literature, but we got to be more inclusive going forward. Or, you know, people are going to stop paying attention. And that's where I think the art form is married to its love of tradition, and it's not being forward thinking in its eye in the future.
Excellent answer. Can I hit you with some rapid fire questions here?
Sure, let's do it.
Are you an introvert or an extrovert?
I'm an introvert.
You're an introvert. Tell me how that works as an opera singer.
It's actually kind of great. So I love my alone time, and to be an opera singer, you have to do a lot of study and work on your own. And then during performance time, you're with a lot of people who have a lot of energy. So sometimes that can be a little draining over the course of like an intense rehearsal period. But there are a lot of wonderful people in opera, and so it can be a real joy. But finding that balance sometimes when we're in performance mode, something that I just have to keep an eye on. But I do find comfort in working on my own, but I really do love people. So it's not that I hate being around them. It's just that I thrive getting alone time and quiet and study.
In terms of maybe accepting or declining roles or choosing a certain path, what's your biggest regret?
I took a job that was underpaid, like really, really underpaid, and had a really bad experience as like connected to that. And I knew, and in the moment, that I was accepting less than I was worth. And I had a lot of frustration with the whole thing, but I had agreed to it. So I didn't feel that I could back out after agreeing to it. But it was really one of the most uncomfortable jobs that I've had in my life. And I would not ever, ever take that little for performing ever again. And it did teach me an important lesson about asking for what I'm worth as a performer and making sure that I got contracts signed and getting the letter of what's expected of me up front.
Musicians, know your value. Know your value. All right, here's another one. What is better? We talked about a lot of challenges, right? What is better about the music industry now than when you were growing up?
There's a lot more kindness in the process, I think. I think people are more attentive to being considerate about differences in, you know, abilities and what have you. I think there's a lot more intention to be kind than there was in the past. And I think that's really important. And I'd like to see the industry go further in that.
When you're not listening to opera, what are you listening to?
A little bit of everything.
Give us your guilty musical pleasure.
I love Shakira. I like dancing in my in my living room. I listen to a lot of Latin American music. Honestly, it's got this great beat. I love dancing, and dancing is a way that I restore and renew my energy. And then I've been listening to a lot of EDM sometimes, especially when I'm not, you know, working. It's positive energy, positive vibes.
If you had any idea what was on my Running in the Mountains playlist, it's not pretty, but it gets me there.
Exactly.
What's the last book you read that you'd recommend to someone?
Oh, I read a lot. So the book, A Stroke of Insight by Jill Bolte Taylor. Absolutely phenomenal story about a woman who had a stroke, and she herself was a neuroscientist. So her experience of losing her left brain functioning and being in her right brain connected to everything experience is something that is a life-changing book that I can't recommend strongly enough to everybody that they read. She's written another book too about going into further detail. Both of those books are just phenomenal.
I'm familiar. That is an amazing book. And didn't she actually sort of turn her clinical eye on herself and
Yes.
sort of gave an inside out analysis of what that was like?
Yeah, the whole story is phenomenal. Where she's talking about losing her sense of boundaries for the I, like I am. She lost that sense of I am and was only in the we are space. And as somebody who loves that we are space and it's connected to my ideas about the infinite space of connection, it was a really empowering book to read from somebody who very specifically understands the biological processes that happen in our brains. And to have her explain some of these things, it was just really insightful and informing of the way I want to live in the world.
Last question, and I ask this of everybody. If there was or existed an actual honesty pill that could change one thing about you instantly, this could be adding a superpower or a skill or removing a weakness, your kryptonite, what would it be?
I would love it if I could just skip the whole procrastination process that I go through, because it's not actual doing nothing ever, because that's not my MO. It's always doing the thing adjacent to the thing that needs to happen the most. If I could get on track, the thing that needs to happen the most, I'd be good to go.
The Honesty Pill anti-procrastination prescription. I'll get to work on that. That's very good. Elizabeth Gentner, thank you so much for spending this time and for educating us. This was a great conversation. Where can people learn more about your courses, your coaching, your podcast? Where can they find all that?
Thank you so much, Chris. It was so great to be here. I am at thereddiva.com. You can find everything about me there. It connects to all of my social medias. Just go to the website and you can find what about me you're looking for right on the top.
And you can follow Elizabeth on Twitter at EF Gentner.
Yes.
That is the one place she is not the Red Diva. So check it out. I follow her. Maybe I'll even start tweeting. Like maybe I should check that out.
It's a great place to connect. We have fun there. So it's a lot of snark, but it's fun.
I love me some snark. Elizabeth, thank you so much.
Thank you.
We'll connect soon, and great chatting with you.
Likewise.
Well, what can I say? Big thanks to Elizabeth Gentner for schooling us on all things opera, all things auditions, and helping us to smash the patriarchy that has existed in classical music for, well, way the hell too long, and sharing her thoughts on what the future of our industry might look like. You can find out way more by visiting thereddiva.com, and you should totally check it out. There's a lot of good information over there, and do yourself a favor and get on Elizabeth's mailing list right now. All right, everybody, this has been the Honesty Pill Podcast, episode 32. You can find out more at honestypill.com. And please, if you like what you're hearing on this podcast, take a minute to head over to Apple Podcast and leave a review. It really does help other people find this content, and I really appreciate hearing from you. Okay, I'm out of here. I have about 150 pounds of music to prepare for the next few weeks. I'm going to go practice. Thank you for listening. See you next time.